good to be here with you all. I want to begin with some reflections on the college experience. So this is in Columbus, Ohio. And I want to highlight, it's interesting here at New St. Andrews in the CALD conference to reflect upon this a little bit, about how universities today mold and shape the identity of their students to make them members of their community. This is a process of identity formation that's very important in today's American college experience. It's a process that applies to people who are ages 18 to 22, an impressionable season of life. It's carefully studied, it's deliberately undertaken, and a substantial commitment of capital, financial resources are dedicated to forming the identity of 15 to 22-year-olds. This gets us into the consumer world of marketing, of merchandising, of media, of branding, especially in big-time athletics at our universities. So you're looking at what's nicknamed the Horseshoe in Columbus, Ohio. When the Buckeyes, the Ohio State Buckeyes, play Michigan in this stadium, it fills about 110,000 people in this space. And when the Ohio State Buckeyes take the field, we've got 11 young men on the field, but there are tens of thousands of people across Buckeye Nation who are experiencing the game sort of through them, vicariously through them. If the Buckeyes are doing well, then thousands upon thousands of people are doing pretty well. If the Buckeyes face a setback, then thousands upon thousands of people are a little downcast. This shows us that these men, 11 men on the field, represent much more than the 11 men on the field. And I want you to consider various facets of this. They wear scarlet and gray. People, thousands of people are clothed in certain colors, and they're clothed in a way that's deliberately crafted to forge and to reinforce a connection with a group. They also chant. They chant with one voice, and they do it on cue, sometimes accompanied with choreography. New freshmen who come to Columbus are catechized into the community through corporate unison chanting, yelling, shouting, waving their colors, making all the right gestures at all the appointed times on cue. The point is simply to take those individuals on the team and draw everyone into Buckeye Nation so that they will be participants with them through rituals, through gestures, through choreography, like reciting a creed or singing in unison. And here's another view. They sing songs. Individuals who would otherwise never be caught dead singing will shout at the top of their lungs the fight song. And they do it in unison. And that fact is important. It's a collective ritual performance. It's aimed at forming and reinforcing an identity into a sacred community bond. They even have relics. I'm showing you here. These Ohio State fans pulled sod from the stadium floor after the Buckeyes capped an undefeated season defeating Michigan. And so we want a piece of the grass to preserve forever. Yes, they have sacred icons. Sacred icons that represent the community. And so you'll wear these logos to identify yourself as a member of Ohio State. Now, our neighbors across the border at Washington State are very proud that their logo has been deemed the best college logo out there in collegedom, for whatever that's worth. That's an interesting thing to be proud of, but nonetheless. Now, I want you to think about something. What happens when things go badly for Ohio State? When things go badly, the community members go casting about for a scapegoat, someone to blame. Maybe it's the poor officiating. Maybe it's a coach's bad job calling the plays. Maybe it's the quarterback's bad performance or his recklessness. And the community members have to share, they have to discuss their ideas about whose fault it is, where the problem lies in order to purge the community of offending behavior that resulted in a loss. The search for individual affirmation and the work toward a group consensus here on who to blame, and then a coach might get fired. That's when the community kind of centers and comes to a consensus on who it is that they should blame. And so the Day of Atonement comes when a coach is fired or when they bench the quarterback or some such thing. If you think that a big-time college football coach, if you think his job is just a job defined by salary and contract provisions, then you don't understand the liturgical and the sacramental culture of college football. And those who wear the school colors in an official representative capacity are the ones upon whom the whole community projects their collective beliefs about ideal personhood. So if you look at these young women, in today's culture, there is no shortage of venues or arenas where you can go to look at pretty young women in alluring outfits. Why then is it so important that of all girls, these particular girls have to display a particular kind of attractiveness? Because it's not just about pretty girls, it's about our pretty girls, where we project our ideals in which they stand in a representative capacity. The uniform matters. The uniform matters. Why do the members of Buckeye Nation care? Why do the colors and uniforms matter? Because to Ohio State fans, these are our cheerleaders. They form and reinforce the community's sense of what it is, who it is, its ideals. These cheerleaders are not out there on their own. They stand for something, and they form and shape the identity of tens of thousands of people who project their own Buckeye Nation ideals upon these young women. In the same manner that they identify vicariously with the players on the field, so it is with the cheerleaders. And enough of the cheerleaders then, back to the fans. So what do we make of the colors and the collective chanting and the unison shouting and the icons and the scapegoating and the projections of ideal personhood? What do we make of it? These are religious performances that tap into the fiber of our humanity. How can you help but become a lifelong devoted Buckeye if you're in Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State? How could you help it otherwise? God made us to form community around shared experiences, around shared symbols, around shared activities, shared rituals and gestures, and clothing and attire, and around performances that we engage in and shared ideals. God formed humans to form community. I would suggest to you that in today's state universities in the United States, this is where we see the most humanity played out. In fact, one of the reasons for the gridiron excellence, I would submit to you, this is something that we do really, really well in the United States. One of the reasons why I suggest colleges do this so well is they're compensating for the inhumanity in the classroom. This is where they excel. This is how you know them. This is how you encounter them. Football succeeds on college campuses by tapping into true humanity, compensating for inhumanity that lies elsewhere. Football pursues excellence to compensate for mediocrity that's somewhere else on college campuses. And this is where we see human beings excelling as humans. And it's a divine calling, as you can see in the images that I'm projecting here. Now, I've talked about Ohio State, and there's a reason why I picked Ohio State, but you know that I could just go, oh, here we go. God is good. God is great. Thank you, God, for Ohio State. But I could go to Texas, of course, where things are big in Texas, and I could just work through and make the same points. I could go to Alabama, and I can... Yeah, and if you've been listening to what I'm saying, that's a curious reaction. Alabama, and then we can come right here to the Palouse at Washington State University here. There's the Cougars, and even here in little old Moscow, we've got our modest little Vandals. All right. Now, this kind of experience, this identity-forming, shaping experience that I submit actually taps into humanity. I think you can probably, I haven't said this, but I hope the point registers with you. There's something disordered about it, and yet it is humane in a deep way. And yet there's something disordered about it. Well, this kind of experience is something that people are willing to pay for. The connection between money, athletics, and higher education has always been a troubling one. These are public, because they're public universities, they're public statistics. This is football revenue, not athletic department revenue, but football revenue and football expenses. And Ohio State has been doing the best at that, which is why I led with Ohio State. But if you look at the revenue, $250 million over $225 million in expenses, they're making $25 million a year on football. And then as you go down, number 2 is Texas, number 3 is Alabama, and so on. And for points of interest, I put some local and regional. You can see that Washington State University ranks 53, University of Idaho 139, Eastern Washington University 206. But we're still talking about money. Now, one of the curious things about Washington State, and this gets us into state politics, is they're running a serious deficit. But that's another story. You'll notice that their expenses and their income are a little out of whack. All right. But I'm here to tell you that this is nothing new about football. This is Harvard from 1904, in the early days of American football. And you see now, and these are dollars, if you were to project what these represent today, we've got didn't quite carry off, but it's 1904 and 1903. So we've got the two numbers on the left, income 72,000, expense 15,000, income 57,000, expense 15,000. That's a lot of money they're making. Okay. Here's an article that's commenting on this. This is from the Chicago Tribune in 1905. Receipts from the big football games have been so large and have increased so much that in the last 8 years, that unless something is done to check the evil, athletics may soon become more important than colleges themselves in the public eye. In 1905, they were worried that athletics might become more important than the colleges themselves in the public eye. We view with alarm the tremendous amount of money received from football and deplore with the magnitude with the receipts given to athletics. This has actually been a long story. I bring this up to tell you that what I was just showing you is actually not new. It's actually not new. You think, boy, college sports have really blown up. They were talking about this over 100 years ago. All right. Here's some magazine from, again, 1905, McClure's magazine. This expose scandalized a lot of people. It reports payouts to students, admission standards that were fudged in order to get great ball players admitted, passing students who didn't even go to class to keep up their GPA, their academic record, so that they would remain eligible. And then scholarships and work study programs. I'm scare quoting this. Work study programs where the so-called work that they were paid for was to go to football practice. This article featured Eastern schools, but the problem was widespread across the Midwest as well. And here we see this article is going to cover, Collier's article talks about it in the Midwest. So here we have Harvard's revenue again. We're making big money. They're making big money at this. All right. So what I'm going to do is pivot then to talk about an earlier age of football. I've begun with football today, but all of this was developing over 100 years ago And so I'm going to rewind the clock and talk about a little over 100 years ago. And as I do, I want you to look for this pattern. Football's creation story is a really interesting story, and that's what I'm going to relate to you. And it's a story of abuses on and off the field, but mostly on the field, foul and unsportsmanlike play, which leads to rule changes. And so you get abuses and then change the rules to try to cover the abuses, and then you change the rules and you try to cover the abuses. The Genesis account of American football is really a story of rules made, then those rules are broken, and so the rules are changed, and then the rules are broken in a new way, and then they're changed, the rules are changed again in an endless cycle, and an endless cycle. It's a story of libertines and Pharisees. Libertines who abuse the game, and Pharisees who respond to those abuses by new rules. Libertine footballers see rules as really small in their scope, really small in their range of application. Libertines use ludicrous behavior, excuse ludicrous behavior on the grounds that there's not a rule against it. So like imagine, if you can imagine concentric circles here, and my fist represents a ludicrous behavior. If you think of a rule as having a big sweep, then the rule testifies against the offending behavior. But if you think of the rule having a small range, a small reach, then, there's nothing wrong with it. And that's what a libertine will always argue. There's not a rule against it, therefore it's okay. So then the Pharisee is going to respond by saying, let's adopt another rule that addresses this behavior. And the rules have to multiply because all the rules speak very narrowly to the human condition. We'll talk more about that as the talk goes on. All right. So let's move into this here. The origins of American football. They didn't really have photographs back then. This is a woodcut of football at Harvard in 1857. Football really got going kind of during the Civil War on college campuses. And then following the Civil War in Princeton, we see some rules starting to develop. Like, okay, what are the rules of this game? In the year 1867, the ball itself is patented as a football. All right. And then we see a couple years after that, in 1869, the very first intercollegiate game between Princeton and Rutgers. And if you know your New Jersey geography, you know that New Brunswick, where Rutgers is just 15 miles down the road from Princeton. And so these two nearby colleges played against one another. That was the first spherical game. That was the first intercollegiate game. And I said spherical, but describe the game. They played with a spherical ball shaped like a basketball and about that size. There were 25 players on a side. The first team to 6 goals wins. And if we were to watch it playing, we might think it's kind of like soccer, except you got 25 guys on a side. The players could use their hands, but they just couldn't run with the ball and advance it. So you could pick up the ball, but you had to be still. If you were going to advance the ball, you had to kick it. So it was called football. All right. Rutgers won, beat Princeton by 6-4 in the first intercollegiate football game. Now, at the time, you got 25 against 25. It was a pretty physical game. One of the observers of this first game said that the two captains had come together and agreed to keep violence to a minimum. But then, as the game progressed, it was really rough with cheap shots. And one old man who was watching said, "These young men will come to no decent Christian end." This game became popular on a lot of college campuses. A student at Yale wrote this verse to kind of capture the play here. He says, "There were yellings and shoutings and wiping of noses where the hue of the lily has changed to the roses. There were tearing of shirts and ripping of stitches and breaches of peaches and pieces of breeches." basically, it was also kind of a mob where guys would beat each other up and then try to score goals. That's really what was going on. Now, in 1873, though, when you've got the game really started forming on these campuses, and the students would play, but then they would take the best team from one campus against the best team from another campus and play against each other. But this means that they need to figure out what the rules are, because the game might have been a little different at Harvard than it was at Yale, and still different from Princeton or Rutgers. But if you're going to play each other, then you need to standardize the rules, because there were variations on the different campuses. And so they got together to have a big meeting in 1873 to standardize them. So now we can have intercollegiate play. We could have teams that play at your campus play against teams from our campus over there. And this standardized version deployed, like I said, rules that we might think of as kind of like soccer, except you can pick up the ball. Okay. Now, the move to standardized rules created an interesting circumstance where if you changed a rule, that rule change applied everywhere, which didn't used to happen before you started into standardization. All right. Now, this paves the way for an interesting development the next year in 1874. Let's see here. What's going on here? This is messing with me. All right. Where Harvard is going to play against McGill University. Now, McGill University is up in Toronto. Harvard is kind of in the Boston area, and then Toronto. You have to go north, and you're crossing the river into Canada, and that's where McGill University is. Now, these Canadians, they're very British, and they played a British game that we think of as rugby, that takes its name from a British school. And so Harvard's going to play McGill, and they have to decide what game they're going to play. Do you play the American game or do you play the British game? McGill guys play the British game, and the American guys play the American game. What they decide to do is we'll play two games. One game, the first game, we'll play our American version, and in the second game, we'll play again, but we'll play under your rules. And we would recognize it as rugby, what McGill played. Now, they played the second game under these rules, and the Harvard guys thought, this is a way better game. We taught them our game, they taught us theirs, but we kind of like their game better. And so the Harvard guys came back to this association the next year saying, hey, those Canadian guys have this awesome game. Okay, let's change the rules so that the game we play is now that game rather than the one that you typically play. And so in 1876, the Intercollegiate Football Association that had Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they changed the rules, and they changed from a round ball to an oblong ball. They reduced the number of players from 25 to 15, and they agreed to adopt the rules of rugby, pretty much. So this is going to be the new, but it still retains the name football, which is interesting. All right. Well, what happened in the wake of this was a whole lot of brutality. Players wore no caps, no headgear. The game was divided into 45-minute halves, 45 minutes first half, 45 minutes second half. There were no timeouts. There were no huddles, just a continuous flow of play, except for the halftime intermission. Players basically ran until they dropped or were too injured to keep playing. Fist fights were commonplace. A guy would get knocked down, and it would not be uncommon for his teammates to pile on to the guy who had been knocked down. And it went unsupervised. And if an injured player, if a guy couldn't play because of injury, he left the game, but there were no substitutions. So you know what that's going to incentivize? We're going to get a competitive advantage if we injure the opposing players. It was a brutal, brutal game. All right. And there were accounts of people, some people they suffered life-altering injuries. They were wheelchair-bidden as a result of this. So in 1880, this rule association has to adopt some new rules. How are we going to curtail the violence of the game? All right, we need new rules. Okay, let's reduce the number of players again, first of all. Let's go from 15 now to 11 players on a side. And then the second rule from 1880 was far more radical. Let's eliminate the scrum. And if you know anything about rugby, you know that basically you'll have the guys on each side sort of lock shoulders against one another and sort of push in, and then the ball's going to wind up getting rolled in between them, and you try to push the other side so that the ball's going to get on your side. That makes sense. That's called a scrum. That's called a scrum. Of course, a lot of injuries were taking place during the scrum. A lot of cheap shots, punches, that sort of thing. And in order to curb the violence, what we're going to do is just take turns with possession. And so they adopted a line of scrummage, which is going to get morphed into scrimmage, or the scrimmage rule. So let's take turns. One team will have possession, and then after their possession, the other team will have possession. We're going to eliminate the scrum. Why are we eliminating the scrum? Because people were behaving like ungentlemanly cads. And so we're going to try to curb the violence with a rule. Now, was the violence of the game that prompted the rule change part of good play, the whole purpose being to score a goal as best you can? No, it was about cheap shots, right? And so we answer that with a rule. We answer it with a rule, and we get the line of scrimmage. Here is the language of the rule that was adopted in 1880. A scrimmage takes place when the holder of the ball, being in the field of play, puts it down on the ground in front of him and puts it in play with his foot. The man who receives the ball from the snapback shall be called the quarterback, and shall not then rush forward with the ball under penalty of foul. All right. So the problem was just unnecessary roughness, and the solution is to adopt the scrimmage rule. All right. Now, violence had been part of the game since the inception, but this new rugby version of football is now being reformed a little bit. All right. Now, right after this takes place, I want to take you to Princeton. So at the time, Princeton was deemed the champion because they had won the championship. The following year, Yale was probably a stronger team and the favored team, and Princeton was kind of the remaining champion, and Yale and Princeton faced off in the championship game again. So this is in 1880, Princeton versus Yale. Yale's favored, but the Princeton guys reason this way, though. We are the current reigning champions because we won last year. So if we can play for a tie, then we will continue to be champions, right? And so you know what they did? They adopted a strategy where once they got possession of the ball, they would not try to advance it. They would just kind of hold the ball as the time elapsed, and then another down, and then another down, and they're stopped, and they would hold on to the ball. You think this is kind of boring? Yes. And they played for a tie. And so it's a 0-0 scoreless tie, but Princeton continues to be champion by virtue of having won the previous year because they were kind of scared to actually go up against Yale that year. Now, is that part of the spirit of the game, of competition? No. So you know what happens in 1882, the Rules Committee needs to get together. Actually, before I get there, look, I love the press coverage of this game here. It says, vain work at football. This is a great headline of the championship game from 1880. A Princeton player would roll the ball 6 inches over the foul line so that another could snatch it and bring it back, only to repeat the act. This was allowable, of course, but it looked a great deal like cowardice, and the crowd took it that way. No amount of hissing could make Princeton change her safe policy, however, and when time was called for the same monotonous byplay was going on. So there's the press report from this? Well, we need to come up with a solution now. And the solution is, let's have another rule, downs. Let's limit the number of instances that a team can put a ball in play. Otherwise, possession will revert to the other side. So we got the scrimmage rule, which is instituted because during the scrum, guys were beating the tar out of each other. And so let's take turns with possession then. And then once you take turns with possession, you have Princeton who says, hey, I know, let's not even try to score or advance the ball because it's our turn. And so let's make the whole game our turn. And so then you need another rule. Okay, downs. And this is how it plays. It's really interesting. The new rule in 1882 was 3 downs to advance the ball 5 yards or backwards 10 yards. Just so long as the ball's moving one direction or the other. Otherwise, if it's after 3 downs and hasn't gone either backwards 10 or forwards 5, then possession turns over to the other team. In order to keep track of yardage, they needed to start putting lines on the field now, which you didn't. You don't need lines on a rugby field, but if you've got 5 or 10 yard intervals to track, now you've got a downs rule, you need to put lines on the field. And a newspaper reporter who was covering a game said, this kind of looks like a gridiron. And that name has stuck, referring to the lines that were newly introduced as a result of the downs rule. All right. So when you put those two rules together, I would say that really makes the essentials of how you differentiate rugby from American football. Number 1, scrimmage replaces the scrum, and you actually assign possession one at a time. And then you limit the number of attempts with possession, the downs rule. The scrimmage rule plus the downs rule produces a game that's radically different than rugby. That is football. But I hope you see the pattern playing out. The libertine exploits his liberty. There's not a rule against it, so it's fine. There's not a rule against it, so it's fine. And what's the answer? Let's make a rule. Let's make a rule. These two ingredients, scrimmage and downs, separate rugby of the old world from New World American football. But we already see an interesting cultural posture surrounding the game, what I call this libertine Pharisee dynamic, where we don't have people playing with one another in an attempt to outdo their opponent by athleticism, force, skill, that sort of thing. We're trying to outdo our opponent by circumventing, doing something other than athleticism, force, and skill. It's not virtuous behavior, but there's not a rule against it. Anyone who's not virtuous will justify their behavior by saying, but there's not a rule against it. But there's an assumption about the nature of rules. I'm not about virtue. I am a conformer to rules and precepts. That's who I am, right? And then the Pharisee will say, yes, we agree that that's what the nature of rules. It's not about virtue. And so the Pharisee will just legislate against it. They both agree that rules are not pointing to virtues. Rules are just rules with a small range and a small reach describing human behavior. I hope you see how that plays out. Now, so this is back to that dynamic again in play that I've described. Now, once they develop this, we get the game of American football playing along. Princeton developed this really great idea. They called it the flying wedge, a V formation. Harvard later perfects it. But what it means is basically this, that you've got the ball on the line of scrimmage, and the guy is going to snap the ball to the quarterback. But meanwhile, everyone else on the team is going to start 15 yards back. And they're going to start up and build up momentum to a sprint. And when they come to the line of scrimmage, that's when the ball is going to get snapped. And they blow over and mow down the people on the opposing team. and then the ball carrier can follow the flying wedge. What do you think the result's going to be? Oh my goodness, this was a serious problem. The injuries, broken bones. Again, people were crippled, maimed for life as a result of this kind of play. So the rules committee needs to meet again and develop another rule. This rule is going to prohibit offensive motion. If you're familiar with football, and if you've watched a football game and you see the referee do this, which means false start, it's always against the offense because the offense can't move before the snap. The defenders are jumping and moving around everywhere, right? That goes back to this rule change to put an end to the flying wedge. They also require 5 of the people on the offense to be on the line of scrimmage to prevent the flying wedge, to try to make the game safer from the brutality. So if you're familiar with football and the play of football, you can start to see the game taking shape and why and how it does. All right. Here, I love this. I want to highlight this. This is an advertisement from a New York newspaper. I think it's the New York Times. And it's a guy, it says, "The Tragedies of Football." This is the Woodbury Dermatological Institute. And this guy says, "I perform reconstructive surgery on noses." And the fact that somebody can build a business around reconstructing noses tells us about football right now at this moment. Like, hey, bring your broken noses from football to me. I am profiting off of this. This is you have to think about the world that creates an advertisement like this. The injuries and the brutality of the game were pretty dramatic at that time. Let me see here. We've got more brutality is just going to take place. Again, we wind up with circumstances where even still the game continues despite the efforts of reformers to modify the game. There were a number of, let me rewind here. There's Little League football is kind of named after this guy. There were a bunch of other rules that started coming in. There were rules, for example, about, teams would muff the kickoff on purpose. Like the whole idea is to kick it off to the other team. They would just muff it and then grab it. Hey, we've got possession now. Okay, don't do that. Let's have a rule about kickoffs. The kickoffs have to go 10 yards. There was another team that took the uniforms and took suitcase handles and sewed suitcase handles onto the hips of their uniforms so that the team members, like if I'm on a team, I would grab the hip of my teammate while he's grabbing my hip, and we would go like this and sprint down the field and mow down the opponent. I mentioned Pop Warner because this is one of my favorites. He was coach of the Carlisle Indians, but if you're familiar with the football, even old footballs like that are similar today, where they're made up of 4 panels of leather. If you can think about a football and it's got 4 panels of leather. Well, they would take actual footballs and cut them in half. You can cut the stitching off the footballs. And so you've got half footballs, and they would applique the half footballs onto the jerseys so that every player on the team had a half football on his jersey. And then they would have a play where one guy would catch the ball, and then they'd all gather, and the other team would not know who the ball carrier is because they all have half footballs appliqued to their jerseys. All right, now, a lot of people thought that was really clever, but the rules committee needs to get together and they find rules about, okay, uniforms have to have certain standards. There are certain things you can and you can't do on uniforms. That was fine because There wasn't a rule against it, right? You're seeing the pattern. There wasn't a rule against it. So you get uniform rules, all that. I do think that's clever, but it's kind of cheap. So the brutality is going to continue with cheap shots, that sort of thing. These articles highlight criticism of the game's brutality. The brutality continued to increase. People were basically losing their futures because of the injuries that they would suffer. Publicity reported deaths of high school and college students on football fields were about 100 a year, roughly, around the country. Some of them were really high profile, like what you see in these articles. A lot of calls to reform the game. You got a political cartoon like this with the Grim Reaper over a football game. But there's money to be made in football. We can't stop the money-making machine, and it's identity forming. And so we can't just put a stop to it. In addition to the brutality, it's around this same time, I already showed these articles about the financial scandals that were surrounding football, around the same time. So we've got colleges that are letting people in, looking aside from their admissions requirements because they're good football players. They'll let them in, or they'll let them pass the class, or they'll even manufacture fake classes for them. All of that's being documented here. There's a lot of reform that needs to come to the game, and a lot of people wanted to put a ban to the game. And eventually, this is going to come to fruition in a big set of rule changes in 1906. We can't ban football, but we need to come up with rules again. The Libertines control the spirit of the game, but so do the Pharisees, and the Pharisees answer with the same answer. There's not a rule against it. Well, we'll adopt another rule. There's not a rule against it, so we'll adopt another rule. Is anyone thinking about virtue? No one is thinking about virtue. That is the American way. The story of football tells us that. And the Rules Committee met in 1906 to address some sweeping changes. One of them, and you see them all listed here, I'll walk through them. They actually put definition to they had talked about unnecessary roughness in the past, and now there's finally a rule against it. And then they impose a 15-yard penalty for unsportsmanlike conduct. Now, I want you to think about this. If you've ever played a board game, anyone played a board game like Monopoly or Life or something like that, and you look at the rules, are there provisions of the rules for penalties for unsportsmanlike conduct? No. When you look at the rules of a game just simply describe, okay, what's the object and how does play work, right? You don't bake it into the rules of the game. You don't build a rule that's predicated on the expectation that someone's going to try to break the rules. The 15-yard penalty for unsportsmanlike conduct is a revolution because it acquiesces to the normalcy that people are going to play and try to cheat. Now we have to have a rule of what happens when there's a cheater. You don't see that in the rules of Monopoly. You don't see that in most rules. It's a new thing in 1906. A British observer, someone who is well familiar with rugby, looks at this rule change, and this is how he reacts. He says, "It is a standing insult to sportsmen to have to play under a rule which assumes that players intend to trip, hack, and push their opponents and behave like cads of the most unscrupulous kind. I say that the penalties are a disgrace to the playing field of a public school." If you need to have a rule for what to do when someone intentionally breaks a rule, then something's going on here. And now it's just so natural to us that we don't think about it. Well, the third rule, 6 men on the line of scrimmage. limitations on tackles and guards in the backfield, again, to try to spread the game out. That's the third rule. The fourth rule, they adopt the neutral zone, which is still part of the game today. Let's see, you're probably familiar with the neutral zone, where you don't just have a line of scrimmage. Now the line of scrimmage is effectively as wide as the ball. And so the teams have to start off play a little distance from each other, because it was actually before the play as they were lining up when a lot of the cheap shots were taking place. So they need to create a neutral zone. The length of the ball is now forming the line of scrimmage to try to limit the brutality. It also gives officials a line of sight to notice infractions, which is another dimension to it. Officials can now see what's going on down the line of scrimmage when you supply a neutral zone. Now, one of the most consequential rules, though, and I want to talk about this, is the forward pass is legalized. The key to the forward pass is to make the person with the ball not the only potential ball carrier. Maybe somebody 10 or 15 yards away could potentially become the ball carrier through a pass. This is designed to spread the game out so you don't have this cluster of people who are brutalizing each other. So the forward pass is adopted in 1906 to try to diminish the brutality of the game. Now the pass rule was really interesting. They have limitations on it. They knew that this was going to be a radical change, so they didn't want it to be too radical, so they hemmed it in. First of all, you couldn't pass the ball into the end zone. You had to run the ball into the end zone. So the ball had to cross across the end zone into one another's arms to score. The passes had to be a minimum of 5 yards, but a maximum of 25 yards. And the quarterback could only pass the ball if he moved 5 yards laterally. Basically, if you know football today, if he got out of the pocket. So the quarterback had to move 5 yards to one side or the other before he was allowed to pass. This led to having to mark the field in the other direction. And so this were the field markings from 1906 to 1912. And you can see actual fields like this, so that you could determine whether a quarterback had moved sideways to ascertain whether a pass was legal. Following this is what football fields looked like during this stint. That rule about having to move 5 yards sideways is going to get decreased. It's going to get taken away in 1912. But for this season of football's life, there it was. Well, we finally now have the forward pass. And so the game is going to, again, change dramatically. One of the Chicago coach, there we go, Coach Stagg. Very good. So now we're going to have the game being completely transformed. Amos Alonzo Stagg from Chicago is going to be one of the pioneers to figure out, it's now part of the game that we can pass the ball, and he's going to be the first to recognize the possibilities and to develop different ways of doing it. So I'll leave the details there, and I want to bring this in for a landing here. If we could, let's see. Yeah, so those are some of the plays, forward pass plays that I would be happy to talk about, but I won't. Bootlegs and that sort of thing. But I want to bring this in for a landing here, and tell us, what are the takeaways about the story of American football? Well, first of all, I think it captures something that from the turn of the 20th century, this is like 124 years ago, around about there, we start to see something new developing in the American character, the American reform, which is a pattern of Pharisees and Libertines, okay? And a certain attitude toward behavior that privileges rules rather than virtues. And rules, of course, are small in their scope. It doesn't cover very much behavior. And so in order to regulate behavior, you need to multiply the rules. I'd like you to think about biblical rules, for example. So it says, for example, in the Bible, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. What would you say to someone who said, okay, Well, it's not an oxen, it's a steer. There's not a rule against muzzling the steer. The Bible says you can't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. The Apostle Paul takes that in Timothy, and he says, actually, you should pay your pastors. Think about that rule. Don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. What range of behavior is the Apostle Paul reaching with don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain? Like even how you conduct commerce with people. So if you're thinking of virtues, you're going to look at a rule and you're going to think, how is it that I can shape my behavior that's going to embrace the values that this rule specifies? The one who's thinking about virtue is going to be thinking about that. The one who's a libertine is going to say, it's okay because there's not a rule against it. The Pharisee is going to agree that the rule has a small reach, and so he's going to come up with rules for everything. The libertine and the Pharisees are two sides of the same coin, and there we have the American experience with personal conduct. If there's not a rule against it, go right ahead. Oh, we need to adopt a rule against that. And so no wonder in 1912, when the year that the NCAA is formed, the rule book was 112 pages long. The original rugby union rules were 2 pages. Again, think of the difference between, monopoly rules. Like, okay, I'm just going to explain the game, points and downs, that sort of thing, simple rules. And then you go play virtuously versus we got to regulate the behavior. 112 pages of football rules by 1912. That's the American society as it develops right there. All right. And as you think about that, a couple of other things, hopefully this challenges our pet cultural narratives about how, the American spirit of rulemaking and bureaucracy all started much later. No, they didn't start with Franklin Roosevelt. No, they didn't start with, later on in the 20th century. It goes back much earlier. And it also points to an era when the United States became a world power. It is kind of interesting how at that time the United States didn't feel like it had to follow the way English did it. We're saying, the fact that the English play a certain way doesn't matter. We're going to play it our own way. And so they were very happy changing old world rules, which tells us that the United States is emerging as a world power and identifying itself, staking its own claim out in the world. And finally, I hope this shows you that I have given you a historical narrative that didn't mention presidents or generals, challenging the notion that historical significance is reserved for wars and politics. The stuff of history covers a wide range of things, and culture gets shaped in a number of curious ways, and the principal subjects of history are not just necessarily kings and presidents and generals and battles and that sort of thing. When you think about what shapes your world, people who play games can actually shape our cultural tenor too. All right. Thank you very much.